Welcome to the Golden Echo. I'm Ted. I wanted to do a short Christmas tide piece on a particular aspect of the story of It's a Wonderful Life that has been increasingly illuminated for me, that I think paints a picture of some particular aspects of redemption that are really, really insightful. So, in It's a Wonderful Life, George Bailey, the main character, follows something of the path of Job, where he's a righteous man who he does the right thing, he upholds his community, he keeps the poor and downtrodden from destruction, and then he himself is faced with a calamity that is not his fault, that comes on him from the outside that he can't understand, and it drives him to a place of great despair. And from there, he is suddenly lifted up. There's a restoration of his life and his fortunes. His friends and family come back to him. They all bring something. In the case of It's a Wonderful Life for George Bailey, it's piggy bank money, tips, the little bit that those around him have managed to eke out. In the case of Job, it's I believe a golden earring and a silver coin, and so there's this way in which they're both restored out of this calamity which they have suffered, as righteous men, which is wonderful. And the picture at the end of It's a Wonderful Life is a beautiful picture, with all of his friends and family gather around him with the money, symbolizing the true wealth of the righteous deeds that he's done, and love for those around him, in the tree of life, bedecked with glory in the back of the room, crowned with the angelic hierarchies. But there's a particular aspect of the way that George Bailey's fortunes are restored that I really love. And so I'm gonna leave that right there, and I'm gonna go to Tolkien's essay on fairy stories. And there's a couple of things I want to read, and then I want to bring those in. So he says, of course, fairy stories are not the only means of recovery or prophylactic against loss. Humility is enough. There is, especially for the humble, Morafok, or Chestertonian fantasy. Morafok is a fantastic word, but it could be seen written in every town in this land. It is coffee room, right? So it's just coffee room backwards, viewed from the inside through a glass door, as it was seen by Dickens on a dark London day, and it was used by Chesterton to denote the queerness of things that have become trite when they are seen suddenly from a new angle. That kind of fantasy most people would allow to be wholesome enough, and it can never lack for material. But it has, I think, only a limited power, for the reason that recovery of freshness of vision is its only virtue. The word morefec may cause you suddenly to realize that England is an utterly alien land, lost either in some remote past age glimpsed by history, or in some strange dim future to be reached only by a time machine, to see the amazing oddity and interest of its inhabitants and their customs and feeding habits. But it cannot do more than that, act as a time telescope focused on one spot. Creative fantasy, because it is mainly trying to do something else, make something new, may open your hoard and let all the locked things fly away like caged birds. The gems all turn into flowers or flames, and you will be warned that all you had or knew was dangerous and potent, not really effectively chained, free and wild, no more yours than they were you. So what Tolkien is getting at there is this notion that fantasy stories in particular, have a role of changing the way that we see things. They are about creating a perspective shift with the things that have become, as he says, tired or trite or ordinary. And Tolkien here, and I agree with him, thinks that this operates at a, let's say, a lower level than other things do. So what is it doing? It's helping me to look at a tree and see its treeness again. Look at a home and see the homeness of it again. Any of the ordinary things of life, being able to, you get that, it's that glimpse where all of a sudden it's become strange enough that you can see it again. Right? So there's this kind of weird valence there where if you don't know what a thing is, you can't really see it, but also if you think you know it too well, then you also can't see it. And so there's this sort of intermediate realm where we have the greatest clarity of vision. It's somewhere between the unknown and the, let's say, believed to be mastered, or the believed to be understood, which is why I think Tolkien brings in the notion of humility there, right? Because humility, being a stance of the person towards reality to see things as they are grants you the capacity to understand that you don't see all that there is. Okay, so that's one function of stories. There's another thing that Tolkien brings in at the end of this essay, and that's the notion of the Eucatastrophe, the good catastrophe. And so I'll bring this here. He says, and I know that I bring this up a lot, but it's really a wonderful thing that he brings in here. He says, the consolation of fairy stories has another aspect than the imaginative satisfaction of ancient desires. Far more important is the consolation of the happy ending. Almost I would venture to assert that all complete fairy stories must have it. At least I would say that tragedy is the true form of drama, its highest function, but the opposite is true of fairy story. Since we do not appear to possess a word that expresses this opposite, I will call it eucatastrophe. The eucatastrophic tale is the true form of the fairy tale, and its highest function. The consolation of fairy stories, the joy of the happy ending, or more correctly of the good catastrophe, the sudden joyous turn, for there is no true end to any fairy tale. This joy, which is one of the things which fairy stories can produce supremely well, is not essentially escapist nor fugitive. In its fairy tale or otherworld setting, it is a sudden and miraculous grace, never to be counted on to recur. It does not deny the existence of discatastrophe, of sorrow and failure. The possibility of these is necessary to the joy of deliverance. It denies, in the face of much evidence, if you will, universal final defeat, and insofar is Evangelium, giving a fleeting glimpse of joy beyond the walls of the world, poignant as grief. So he says this notion that which I think all of us would immediately recognize, which, and if you look at Tolkien's own corpus, is very evident. This idea of the eucatastrophe is, because it's not empirically verifiable, the belief in eucatastrophe as a valuable tool for understanding the world is a matter of disposition towards reality. And by that I mean that it requires a certain belief that reality is structured in a way that produces eucatastrophe, actually and truly. Now, in Tolkien's Eucatastrophe, it comes about by the defeat of Sauron at the hands of Gollum. And there's a particularly wonderful quality to that, in that Gollum is acting selfishly and wickedly, and in those let's say dispositions ends up bringing about the salvation of Middle Earth, because Frodo is incapable of carrying out the deed of destroying the ring. And it's at the moment where things are darkest, right? You've got most of the other heroes in front of the Black Gate being crushed under the armies of Mordor. And Frodo finds himself incapable of renouncing the ring. Sam has been rendered, he's wounded in the crack, lying in the chamber above the Crack of Doom. And there doesn't seem to be anything that anyone can do to stop the ultimate triumph of Sauron, until Gollum's wickedness brings about the salvation of things. And that, it's a good eucatastrophe. And a lot of the eucatastrophic stories that we know and love, they come about through a sudden change of circumstances. What's really interesting about It's a Wonderful Life is that George Bailey's eucatastrophe comes not from a change in circumstances. So if you follow the story closely, what's interesting is that George Bailey's salvation comes before he knows that he's not going to be arrested for bank fraud, before he knows that his family isn't going to be rendered destitute, before he knows that the community that he's served so long is going to come around him and support him. His eucatastrophe comes along before that. The moment when he wants to live, when he's seen what the world is like without the obedience of George Bailey, that's when he's saved. So for George Bailey, his eucatastrophe is not a circumstantial one, which is the kind of eucatastrophe that we all long for, and which, as a Christian, I ultimately believe is there's a final eucatastrophe. But what is presented in It's a Wonderful Life is a perspectival eucatastrophe, which states that your salvation is at hand. And if you change the way that you see things, that salvation is available for you now. And I think about the passage in the book of Hebrews in the New Testament, where we're told to consider hardship as the Lord's discipline, that he only disciplines those he loves. His sons are the ones that he disciplines, not his slaves, not his enemies. That is a eucatastrophic perspective shift right there, right? Because the notion that God provides good things, that's an easy one, right? If God's good, then he will give us good things. But there's still an entire realm of life for everyone that's one of pain and suffering and misunderstanding, right? Even the notion of suffering is as things that overwhelm or overtake your agency. So there are things outside of us, things that we can't control, things that we don't want. What's the resolution to that? And I think that the modern world believes that there is a circumstantial eucatastrophe awaiting us if we simply, there's sort of two ways I think that the world looks at that. One is if we can just get rid of enough of the moral inhibition, then suddenly we'll break through and there'll be that sudden turn and everything will be good. That's one. I think that's one strain of belief. The other strain of belief is fundamentally technological. I think this is what the original Avatar by James Cameron is about. The notion that if we just push hard enough on the development of technology, that suddenly there'll be the breakthrough. We will be back in Eden. Okay, so those are there's sort of two. Those are the two eucatastrophic tales, and they're both fundamentally circumstantial, right? One is that if we can get rid of the moral inhibitions that have tied us up, and we just have freedom, the expression of human desire in this world, then all of a sudden we'll be through, and we'll be in paradise. And the other one is if we could just figure out, if we can just solve the problems, the things, the pain points, the friction, all the language that's used in the tech startup world, then we will be happy, right? Then we'll be in paradise and we'll have shalom. The picture presented by It's a Wonderful Life is neither of those. And in fact, and it's also not about something like a return to a traditional society, which would be a good thing. But for George, it's about what's strange in the case of It's a Wonderful Life is, despite the fact that the story, one of the main themes of the story is the tension between George Bailey's individual life and the life of the community, the salvation of the story is fundamentally individual. It's not about the salvation of the community. It's about the salvation of George Bailey. And in that case, it requires no change in circumstance. In fact, the eucatastrophe precedes the change in circumstance. If George Bailey hadn't had that moment, the turn, if he doesn't have the turn, if he doesn't suddenly see, if he doesn't regard well reality and understand it for what he is, then he would never have gone home and found his redemption, his material salvation waiting for him. And so that reminds me almost immediately of in the Brothers Karamazov, Ivan's, he and Alyosha are having the conversation in which the famous Grand Inquisitor scene comes up. But there's also the passage that everyone likes to quote about beauty saving the world, which is interesting that Ivan, not Alyosha, states that. So that's worth considering. But Ivan has this idea that there will be something that happens at the end of everything that will make us understand all of the suffering in the world up until this point. And his stance is essentially that he refuses that. He would even refuse that. He would refuse understanding the suffering. And that's more or less shading over a lot of things, the path of damnation for Ivan. But that idea, and Ivan, what's interesting is that Ivan casts that into the eschaton. He says that moment of the possibility of reconciliation and integration with reality is something that can only happen after history's done. The notion of the saint is something much more like the possibility of reaching that now. And it doesn't come through. What's interesting is that can't be an intellectual thing for basic numerical reasons, that reality is just too complex for us to see. is an orientation of the will towards reality. And that's exactly what we see in George Bailey. It's his ability, it's his newfound ability to be grateful for everything, right? There's so much of the beauty of that last scene when he's restored to the time that he has existed in. He comes back, and all the things that were causes for anger and frustration and despair on his part, his old car that's wrecked into a tree, the building and loan bank business that he's felt has shackled him to this town his whole life, the knob on the staircase, instead of things that cause anger and resentment towards the world, become icons of gratitude and glory in his life. So, as it says in the movie, to have seen what the world would be like without you. That's a rare gift, and few of us ever do. We don't get it laid out for us in some sort of visionary way that George Bailey does. So what do we do instead? Well, because we don't get to run our life in parallel many times, or the world in parallel many times, to see the meaning of our actions or our decisions or our life or that of our friends or any of these things, it requires a measure of faith in the fundamental goodness of reality, of God himself. And it's the way to see that, well, frankly, the way to see that is to practice the Christian faith in all of its traditions, and to be an ascetic, to be a Christian ascetic in the sense of undergoing spiritual training. This is what fasting is for, in one sense. It's a little bit of that. It's getting to see how good things are. That's a lot of why fasting takes place. It's to rule over your passions so that you can orient yourself towards the highest, right? So your distraction you're not distracted by the low things. This is what happens to George Bailey. He's distracted by the low things. And they seem pretty distracting, right? Like he's going to go to prison for bank fraud and can't find $8,000, which is probably more like, given inflation, like $700,000. We'll just put it that way. It's a lot of money, right? Those things seem like pressing matters, but the depth of his vision is one that grants him the capacity to actually line everything up in his life and see what's most important. And that's why you end up with the symbolism of the end of the movie is just fabulously rich, where he's, halfway up the stairs, covered with his children and embracing his wife. Even the heartbreaking sorrow of a child's little loss, right? Zuzu's rose that loses the 3 petals, right? There's something about the unmixed grief of very small losses to a child that in some ways is almost not rivaled by the later sorrows that grown-ups that adults experience, because it's not as raw, and they have ways of consoling themselves. It fits into a framework. But even Zuzu's, the heartbreak of seeing his daughter's rose wilting, even that gets transformed into a matter of joy for George Bailey. And so I would suggest to you that the Christian mysteries of the Incarnation and the death and resurrection of the God-man Christ are the place in which that perspectival eucatastrophe can take place, in which we don't have to look at the world and say, burn it all down to make a heaven on earth. But instead we can see that it fits into some sort of eucatastrophic scheme, in which even those things, whether they're the balls on the rails on our stairs that keep coming off because we live in a drafty old house, all the way up to being falsely accused of bank fraud and being wanted by federal marshals. All of those things can be taken up and become matters of joy and gratitude. Thank you all for your time, and have a wonderful rest of your Christmas tide.